Well, we agreed beforehand that we only really had one intergenerational challenge, and we won't take up your time, we'll just go to dinner, and that is everyone under 40 needs jobs. So we can just conclude, you agree? Okay, so more seriously, we have a great group here today. I'm not going to go into much detail about their backgrounds, but refer you to the Tarrytown website that's very comprehensive, and just say one or two things about each person. Joe Stramondo is completing his PhD at Michigan State University and is a disability scholar activist who lectures very widely. So there's an employment possibility there for you to connect with Joe. Magdalina Gugucheva is completing her JD at Harvard Law School and is also interning with the Council for Responsible Genetics this summer, also continuing the employment theme. And then we have Jesse Reynolds, who many of us know from the Center for Genetics and Society. And Jesse's only going to be there a little while longer because we're all very happy for him that he's beginning a Fulbright scholarship at the University of Tilburg in the Netherlands, and so we should all wish him well. It's a huge loss for Bay Area policy work around genetics, but we really wish Jesse well. And then to my left is Sujatha Jesudason, who is the founding executive director of Generations Ahead, who began working at this intersection of race, reproduction, and genetics in 2004, and so lends her expertise very well to our conversation. And so this was conceived a little bit differently from the rest of the panels we're enjoying, in that it's more of a fishbowl conversation and not so much planned presentations, but just a sort of fluid thought experiment, and it goes along, I think, with what Marcy was saying at the very beginning of the afternoon, in that we want to try some different things, experiment about thinking and planning strategy in different formats to see what's most generative. And so we're just going to have a conversation today about intergenerational challenges. And just to begin, I'm going to ask everyone just to share their own experience and perspectives on what that exactly means, how they've encountered those intergenerational challenges in more or less a descriptive mode to begin. Joe, would you mind?
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Sure. Just what your experience has been in terms of intergenerational challenges in your own work and your, yeah.
Yeah. Well, first, what I would say is that my training is in philosophy, and so most of what I'm going to say is anecdotal. It's just from my own experience, which sounds like what the question is anyway, so that's useful. And I guess what I would say is that my experience has been as a disability activist and disability scholar, and so most of what I bring to the table is sort of intergenerational conflict or ideas surrounding that specifically. I think I know less about intergenerational issues when it comes to biotech or genetic and reproductive ethics as a whole. And when it comes to the disability community, I think that there really isn't that much in the way of intergenerational difference when it comes to the scholarship. I know that I saw Marcia Saxton in the hall, and I know there's a number of others here that do disability bioethics and that write on this issue, and their work has really influenced what I do. And so I wouldn't point toward any kind of conflict in the scholarship, but more at sort of grassroots level when it comes to sort of the organizing and so on around some of these issues that I've been involved with. There has been some friction among generations. And the divide that I see there has been two sort of big events in American society that have colored the perspective of the different generations that discuss this issue. And one would be Roe v. Wade, and the other would be the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was just celebrated the 20th anniversary yesterday. For some of you who might not realize that. And so within the disability community around this issue, I would see that those two events really do have influence on how the different generations understand these issues. First, I would say that the Americans with Disabilities Act was, of course, a huge shift for our community. And the difference in perspective, I think, that resulted in was that I think the post-ADA generation, I think, has a stronger brand of identity politics than sort of the pre-ADA generation. And I guess, again, this is anecdotal, but within my experience, a lot of times the sort of the rhetoric or the discourse surrounding disability of the pre-ADA generation has a lot to do with sort of overcoming your disability and so on. And the post-ADA generation talks a lot about disability pride, and has been influenced, I think, a lot by the queer movement and so on. And this idea of pride has really taken hold of folks within sort of the post-ADA generation that sort of grew up with all of these rights and these expectations of rights from the very beginning. And so I think that's one big shift. And I think as far as Roe v. Wade goes, I think there's less fear within my generation of sort of turning back the clock. It's sort of an assumed right to choose, and so I think that within the disability community, it's the younger generation is much more apt to be more aggressive in sort of challenging some of these biotechnologies because they never lived in a world without choice, and so they, I think, are a little bit more apt to not have that fear in the back of their minds of are we sort of working against women's rights by saying some of these things. That would be my take on that with a broad brush.
I also am just going to speak about my experiences, and they're fairly limited. I'm still in school, and unlike many of you here, I haven't worked very much in these issues, but I did go through an undergraduate education in the sciences and molecular biology, and I think that part of my experience looking at intergenerational challenges has been as a young person who was really excited about genetics and was really excited coming into my education, was really excited the first time I set foot in a lab. And I think that encapsulates, from what I've seen, the biggest gap between the generations. It's an increased excitement. And I think that this ties into some of what's been said before about how we see innovation progress, and then all of a sudden what I want becomes what I need, becomes a right. And I think that people have commented on how we've gotten used to disclosing our privacy, we've gotten used to disclosing a lot of details about our lives, but we've also gotten used to having all the benefits from that right here. And I think that we're becoming more and more removed from all the previous kind of catastrophes that have happened, and a lot of as advocates pushing for regulation, I think that we remember very, very well the big catastrophes that have come from technology, and I think that we've kind of too much space has gone between the last time that if you want to talk about nuclear disasters, if you want to talk about the eugenics movement, if you want to talk about environmental catastrophes. I realize the BP thing just happened. But we've forgotten so many of the harms that can result, and they haven't happened during my lifetime, and they haven't happened during many young people's lifetime, but we've seen a lot of benefits, and we're just very excited. And I think that really encapsulates the ratio between excitement and fear and knowing the adverse consequences of innovation. I think that really encapsulates the problems with, or the gaps between the various generations.
My observations aren't, I guess, all that personal. In a way, I'm just trying to step back a little bit and see what I have observed, having worked at CGS for a number of years. I mean, one obvious difference among people is age differences and different stages of life, and that's one axis you can cut this. For example, my recent transition to parenthood certainly altered some of the ways I think about reproduction, genetics, technology. Thank you. But the other axis at which this can be cut, I think, touches a little bit on the way that Joe approached it, which is what is the cultural and political environment at the time that different generational cohorts form their normative framework and their political ideologies. I mean, and if I can speak with some really gross, broad generalizations, the political environment in which the older generation developed their ideas. First of all, there was the threat of the bomb, and that's something that's been removed largely from the younger generation. So just thinking about technology and the bomb. Computers were centralized and were a tool of control and oppression. And in the environmental arena, which is where I got my start thinking politically, technology was more often than not the cause of environmental degradation. In Silent Spring, it's DDT that is polluting the environment. And even speaking extremely generally, the dominant framework in the New Left as it grew out of the 60s was relatively communitarian in nature. Now if you turn to the younger cohort, Gen Xers, millennials, or whatever label you choose to use, technology, and in particular computers, have become decentralized, and they are personal, they are liberating, and most importantly perhaps, they have been used increasingly as a powerful tool of political organizing from the bottom, pushing upward. Technology is increasingly seen as a bigger part of the solution to environmental problems. This is green tech, this is whatever, better solar panels to solve our energy crisis. And there's much less talk about going back to the land and living simply. Third, assisted reproduction has been extremely normalized in my cohort, and increasingly the geneticization of our bodies and of medicine. This is something that Stuart touched on earlier. And finally, speaking extremely generally once again, the progressive wing of politics in America is, in my cohort, increasingly individualistic and libertarian in its bias. And all these shifts, I think, have significant impacts on how the cohorts view technology, and more specifically assisted reproduction and genetic technologies.
I grew up as an immigrant in this country, and one of the clear moments that I remember as a young child is my father telling me that you can become the President of the United States. And I grew up in a time where there was this sense, particularly for women, but I think for many people, that you could have it all, right? And for women, oftentimes this is translated into you can have your career and you can have a family. And what women, and particularly the women that we work with at Generations Ahead, are finding is that once you're in your 30s and late 30s and early 40s, having it all means relying on assisted reproductive technologies. And so it's not that anybody grew up expecting to use these technologies, but part of the ideology of having it all means the need to use these technologies. And one of the intergenerational challenges that I see happening often is oftentimes a lot of the discussion is framed around the commodification of women's bodies, the exploitation in the marketplace, worries about privacy. And these are not frames that really speak to a younger generation, in part because part of that ideology of you can have it all was a real sense of agency, that you could advocate for yourself, you were a self-advocate, that you were entitled to having it all, and that you did not need to rely on institutional changes to have it all. And so the sense of both people making the best decisions for themselves in the marketplace, in the workplace, in family life, and if that means relying on these technologies, then that's just as part of the way you do it. And also the conversation around exploitation also tends not to speak to them, and this is talking to young women who are considering egg donation. What they want around a conversation around egg donation is good information for themselves to make the best decisions for themselves, not to be told that if you do this, you will be exploited, that if you do this, you are being commodified. And so I think there's both a challenge in how people are understanding their own experiences, and then also how, if we were to talk about this as a movement, broadly speaking, how we are trying to bridge that divide in terms of reaching out to a younger generation.
A few of you spoke to this, and maybe Sujatha can start, or whoever wants to speak up about the intersection between age cohorts, generation, and other sort of axes of difference, disability, potentially, immigration, race, those types of things. But how is the experience of young people cross-cut by these other differences so that it may not be experienced as pure agency, sort of technophilia by everyone of a certain age cohort?
Well, Joe, I was really intrigued by what you said about the strength of identity politics post-ADA, and thinking, particularly for the communities of color that we have worked with and LGBT communities, that there is, in fact, a much more fluid sense of identity. So it's both more reified, people are more attached to it, but they also can claim a disability identity, a queer identity, people of color identity. And so that both they become places, identities, through which they understand their experiences around these technologies, but it also becomes a place where it's also hard to develop solidarity. So, for example, when we have brought together people across different movements, each identity movement has its sort of deal breaker about, well, we will not give on this issue and we will not give on that issue. And even if one person is holding multiple identities, they're able to say, as a queer person, I'm not going to give up on assisted reproductive technologies to have a family. And, as a person with a disability, I can still sort of hold that and critique the technology.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to sort of intersection and intersecting identities, the disability movement is kind of playing catch up in some ways. I think, and again, this is mostly just anecdotal, but I think that we're, still having sort of the pride parades at this point, and still sort of developing sort of as a movement around that identity to some degree. Although I do think that where intersectionality is being addressed is in the younger generation. I think that there are lots of folks sort of post-ADA again, that are talking about the intersections of race and gender and sexuality and all of these intersecting identities. And so I agree that for the younger generation, it is it's almost paradoxical in that we have this thing going on where we are sort of loud and proud, but at the same time recognizing that there's difference within our difference. So yeah, I think that would be right to say.